Picture this. There comes a point in the life of a big Indian steel company when it ends up owing 47,000 crore rupees to about 30 banks after years of breathless expansion across states. Creaking under its own weight and unable to pay back the loans, the company makes it to an infamous list by the RBI, the list of the dirty dozen. And what follows is a years long meandering and gargantuan task to bring the matter to its natural conclusion, but not before a controversial debate between legal soundness and economic logic in insolvency proceedings. In today's edition of Everybody's Business, we'll talk about Bhushan Power and Steel Ltd or BPSL, its journey through success and failures, the birth of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, and how it ties in to this story. We'll also talk about how the Supreme Court nearly shook the very foundation of investor confidence in the country. Given how intricate this story is, we'll break it down into chapters. And the first chapter is about how Bhushan Power and Steel was born and how it eventually ran into massive financial trouble. Let's begin. The Bhushan name traces back to the Bhushan Group, which was founded by Brij Bhushan Singhal in the late 1970s as a steel business. It started as a modest operation that fed into automobiles and white goods manufacturing. In the early 1980s and 90s, the group expanded into manufacturing cold rolled steel and galvanized steel sheets, gradually becoming one of India's largest secondary steel producers. In simple terms, cold rolling is the process of strengthening steel by changing its shape without using heat. Galvanized steel is steel with a zinc coating for durability, and secondary steel is basically reused steel. Now, in 2002, the group split into two entities. Brij Bhushan Singhal's two sons, Sanjay and Neeraj, started running them separately. The older son, Sanjay, took over Bhushan Power and Steel, which is the focus of today's video, and Neeraj took charge of Bhushan Steel. And that's why sometimes there's confusion between the two when one refers to Bhushan Steel. There remained disputes and run ins within the family on running the companies, which only settled about 10 years later when there was clear division of the holdings. Now, the two parallel empires pursued aggressive growth in India's booming steel and infrastructure sector. We'll talk about this in detail a little later, but Bhushan Steel was acquired by Tata Steel in 2018 through the IBC in one of the earliest and smoothest resolutions under the code. The NCLT approved Tata's bid with minimal litigation, and this allowed a quick handover, setting a benchmark for successful time bound insolvency cases. The fate of Bhushan Power and Steel Ltd or BPSL wasn't this straight and smooth. But first, let's finish the story of BPSL's journey through the years. The decade between 2000 and 2010 saw the meteoric rise of BPSL. It set up integrated steel plants in Odisha, Chandigarh, and Maharashtra. The flagship Odisha plant became its key production base, producing steel billets, sponge iron, ferroalloys, and power. Around the year 2005, BPSL began a massive 20,000 crore rupee expansion plan to raise its steel making capacity to nearly 3 million ton per annum. For perspective, that's enough steel to build about 115 Howrah bridges in a year. BPSL secured captive coal blocks and iron ore linkages to fuel its operations. And in this period, the company borrowed heavily from banks to fund the projects. The loans from over 30 banks included those from Punjab National Bank, the State Bank of India, Axis Bank, IDBI, and UCO Bank. By the year 2010, BPSL was seen as one of the fastest growing private steel companies in India, placing alongside JSW and SR Steel in its ambitions, though much smaller in scale. But something else was happening at the same time. BPSL was building a debt trap for itself that would get activated at the first sign of trouble. As global steel prices fell and India's infrastructure boom slowed after 2011, cracks began to show. The global commodity slump hit BPSL's revenues very hard. High interest costs ate into its profits, and the company struggled to service its mounting debt. By 2014, BPSL had borrowed more than 47,000 crore rupees from Indian banks, and much of it was already under stress. But BPSL kept trying to expand. which in a sector like steel is always a very capital intensive effort. So, it continued to borrow and the banks kept restructuring the loans, but the company failed to show recovery. Do keep in mind that around this time, banks, especially public sector ones, kept lending heavily to large corporates despite rising debt. They rolled over or restructured loans instead of classifying them as bad, hoping that stalled infrastructure and projects would eventually recover. Now, so far, this was the easy part of the story. What happened next in the life cycle of BPSL is a web of developments, and I'll try to break it down for you. But before proceeding in the story, we need to understand an important moving part on which things hinge. And that brings us to the next chapter, which is the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, or IBC. Just as BPSL was steeping toward a storm, one of India's most significant economic reforms, the IBC, was enacted in 2016. The bill was introduced in the Lok Sabha by Finance Minister Arun Jaitley in December 2015. It was referred to a joint parliamentary committee which examined and modified the draft. Parliament passed the bill in May 2016 and President Pranab Mukherjee gave assent to the law in the same month. The IBC filled an important and long standing gap, which was the lack of concrete, coherent, and time bound mechanism to deal with large business failures and heavy unpaid debt. Before the IBC, India's insolvency framework was scattered across multiple outdated laws that were seen as a slow, inconsistent, and often misused process by debtors to delay repayment. What was the aim of the law? It was to provide an exit for businesses that could not survive, while at the same time ensuring maximum value for creditors and a second chance for entrepreneurs. Now, the corporate insolvency regulations of this code came into effect in December 2016, introducing a market led creditor in control system. It created a time bound corporate insolvency resolution process, or the CIRP, mandating that insolvency cases be resolved within 180 to 270 days, failing which the company would be liquidated. This upper limit of this period was later increased to 330 days in 2019. The Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India is the regulator and rule maker for this code. The National Company Law Tribunal, or the NCLT, the National Company Law Appellate Tribunal, or the NCLAT, and finally the Supreme Court are the adjudicating authorities. Once a resolution plan is approved by the NCLT under Section 31, it binds all stakeholders. And appeals to the NCLAT are just limited to questions of the law under Section 61. The code discourages revisiting settled issues. Once a plan is approved and implemented, the idea is that it should be final, subject to limited legal review. And this is a very important point. I urge you to keep the following in mind, as you'll find its manifestation later in the story. Finality in cases being settled under IBC is vital because it builds investor and creditor confidence, assuring them that once a resolution plan is approved, it won't be endlessly reopened. This certainty makes investors more willing to commit big capital to distressed assets, strengthening the credibility and stability of India's insolvency regime. Now, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code became the backbone of BPSL's fate after 2017. Let's move to the next chapter in this saga, which begins with how BPSL quickly became a distressed business. As loan defaults of BPSL kept mounting, investigations also began surfacing. The Central Bureau of Investigation registered cases in 2015-16 alleging that the BPSL had diverted funds and misused bank loans. There were charges of inflating stock, and forensic audits by banks pointed to fund diversion and fictitious transactions. And these findings eroded the remaining trusts bank had in the company. Do note that while these were the initial cases, a second major FIR was filed by the CBI in 2019 after PNB reported that BPSL had defrauded a consortium of banks of about 2,400 crore rupees. Now, in May 2017, the Banking Regulation Act was amended to let the RBI direct banks to start insolvency proceedings against major defaulters. Soon after, on June 13, 2017, the RBI named 12 big borrowers with debts above 5,000 crore rupees, and these were the so called dirty dozen. BPSL was one of them. Bhushan Steel, which we have mentioned earlier in this video, was also part of the list, as were companies such as SR Steel, Lanco Infratech, and Amtech Auto. The 12 defaulters together owed banks more than 3.4 lakh crore rupees and accounted for about 25% of the country's bad loans at that point. BPSL was top of the list. The Dirty Dozen became the IBC's first and most important test. BPSL's 47,000 crore rupee insolvency became a precedent setting case, not only for the scale of the debt, but also for testing the court's ability to deliver a transparent, time bound resolution and the importance of a framework to handle corporate failure. The lead lender, which was the Punjab National Bank, filed an insolvency plea under Section 7 of the IBC, which the NCLT admitted on July 26, 2017, formally beginning BPSL's CIRP. The interim resolution professional invited claims soon after. Now, before this alphabet soup starts to throw us all off, let's look at the IBC process in simple terms. Under the IBC, the process begins when a financial or operational creditor or the debtor files an application before the NCLT for initiation of the CIRP. Basically, the CIRP is a time bound procedure to resolve a company's insolvency by restructuring or finding a new buyer instead of immediate liquidation. Once the application is admitted, a moratorium is imposed to halt all legal actions and debt recovery. The tribunal then appoints an interim resolution professional or the IRP. The IRP takes control of the company's management, verifies claims, and constitutes the Committee of Creditors or COC. The COC then confirms or replaces the IRP as the resolution professional or RP. The RP invites resolution plans from potential investors and presents them to the COC for evaluation and voting. If a plan is approved by at least 66% of voting share and cleared by the NCLT, it becomes binding on all stakeholders. If no plan is approved within the prescribed time, which is 330 days, the company proceeds to liquidation. So, by September 2017, the same IRP was confirmed as the resolution professional, and 13 bidders, including JSW Steel, submitted their resolution plans. In August 2018, JSW Steel's proposal scored the highest under the COC's evaluation process. And after negotiations and regulatory changes, JSW submitted a revised plan in October 2018, which then the COC took up for approval. In its final resolution plan, JSW offered about 19,700 crore rupees to acquire BPSL. The COC approved this plan and the NCLT subsequently cleared it in 2019. The offer included both upfront payments to creditors and capital infusion to revive operations, making it one of India's largest IBC resolutions at the time. Yes, the amount of 19,700 crore rupees was just 41% of what BPSL actually owed, but given the grave situation, the banks approved this plan. And JSW committed another 8,550 crore rupees in equity to revive operations. JSW Steel is India's largest private steel maker. As of 2025, it has an installed capacity of about 35.7 million ton per year and reported revenues of nearly 1.7 lakh crore rupees in FY 24-25. It stands at the core of India's manufacturing and infrastructure growth, supplying steel for automobiles, construction, energy, and exports. But even the process of approval wasn't all smooth. During BPSL's bidding, legal disputes arose among the bidders like Tata Steel, Liberty House, and JSW Steel over eligibility. Allegations of late bid submissions and procedural irregularities led to multiple appeals before the NCLT and NCLAT. However, once these were settled, JSW successfully secured an approval. Now, one would think that once the JSW bid was accepted and the takeover process began, it would be smooth sailing here on. Well, one wouldn't be more wrong than this. This was only the beginning of the real chaos. While the process of BPSL's takeover by JSW was on, the Enforcement Directorate stepped in. In October 2019, the ED provisionally attached properties of BPSL under PMLA, and this created an immediate roadblock on handing over clean and unencumbered assets to the buyer. The ED said that the erstwhile promoters had cheated banks and siphoned off funds for private investments. The investigation under PMLA was initiated based on the CBI FIR filed in 2019. It said that the FIR comprised offences of PMLA for cheating banks of 47,204 crore rupees, and that its investigation showed that BPSL and its promoters diverted bank funds to private investments in the form of shares and properties. It's important to note that under the IBC, once a new owner takes over, past liabilities are supposed to be wiped clean. But the ED's move meant that even after JSW had won the bid, it couldn't get control of the assets freely. And that brings us to our next chapter, a long tug of war between the insolvency process and law enforcement. The NCLAT stayed the ED's order, and later, in December 2019, the Supreme Court stepped in and put the attachment of assets on hold. Around the same time, a new section, Section 32A, was added to the IBC, clearly saying that a successful bidder can't be held responsible for offences committed before they took over. That amendment was widely seen as a direct response to cases like BPSL. And in February 2020, the NCLAT upheld the approval of JSW's plan. But appeals kept coming in from old promoters, some operational creditors, and even the ED. The Supreme Court allowed the process to move forward but directed that the money JSW paid should be kept in escrow in case the final verdict went the other way. Because of all these disputes, the implementation plan was delayed for months. JSW finally managed to take control of BPSL in March 2021, nearly 3.5 years after the process began. But even that wasn't the end. The question of whether the ED's attachment could survive under the IBC kept coming up. In December 2024, the Supreme Court clarified that the attached assets should be handed over to JSW but stopped short of ruling broadly on the ED's powers under the money laundering law. And in December 2024, the ED issued a statement. It said that the ED released BPSL assets worth 4,025 crore rupees to JSW. The ED said that it had attached properties like land, building, and machinery on October 10, 2019, since investigation had shown wrongdoing. The main promoter, Sanjay Singhal, was also arrested at that point. Investigations then continued, and the ED attached more assets worth 427 crore rupees held by entities beneficially owned by Sanjay Singhal. It released the BPSL assets in view of the Supreme Court order. And then, months later, came the most dramatic twist in the case, which is our next chapter, the most important one. In May 2025, the Supreme Court quashed the earlier approvals of the JSW plan altogether, citing procedural lapses and ordering that BPSL be sent into liquidation. The May 2025 order arose from the case Kalyani Transco versus Bhushan Power and Steel Ltd, a creditor's appeal challenging the approval of the resolution plan. The decision shocked both the industry and legal circles. Why? Because a completed and even implemented resolution had just been rolled back. Among other things, it was also significant because the Supreme Court used Article 142 of the Constitution. And what does it say? Article 142 empowers the Supreme Court to pass any order necessary to ensure complete justice in a case. It allows the court to go beyond statutory limitations, giving it exceptional power and authority. So, in May 2025, the Supreme Court quashed the already approved JSW resolution plan for Bhushan Power and Steel because it found flagrant violations of the IBC at multiple levels. The Supreme Court said that the process didn't follow the Insolvency Code properly, key eligibility checks on JSW were not done, and important facts about its links to the old promoters were overlooked. The court also noted that JSW's payment structure and delays went against the rules meant to protect creditors. Overall, it ruled that the earlier approvals by NCLT and NCLAT were flawed and ordered BPSL to be sent into liquidation. Now, a handful of commentators said that this judgment underscored that even commercially significant resolutions will not be allowed if there are suppression of facts, delays, or statutory violations. That for stakeholders, the verdict was a lesson that there was nothing more important than regulatory clarity and the integrity of the insolvency guidelines on paper. But this wasn't the popular opinion, not by a long shot. The Supreme Court's order shocked the legal and business communities alike. Using its extraordinary Article 142 powers, the court reversed approvals upheld for years and wiped out a completed deal. Critics warned that this move struck at the IBC's core promise of finality. It unsettled creditors, workers, and investors who had relied on the resolution's stability. The judgment triggered fears about India's insolvency regime, that strict procedural focus might outweigh economic logic, and that completed rescues could still be undone heavily discouraged future bidders. By overturning both NCLT and NCLAT orders without new statutory grounds, the Supreme Court effectively undermined their final authority under the court's own framework of limited judicial review. Bottom line, that even if a court order was more or less right on technicalities, it didn't mean that it was economically wise. According to a money control report, the government felt that there were many errors in the judgment and its review was warranted. Now, another very important thing to keep in mind is that JSW was already doing great things with BPSL. It had fully integrated the entity into its own business. JSW had merged BPSL with itself in 2021 after taking control under the approved plan. The plant's steel making capacity was doubled from around 2.5 million ton to nearly 5 million ton. The workforce expanded from roughly 4,500 to more than 10,000 employees. Production, exports, and profitability all rose sharply under JSW's management, with BPSL operating as a major part of its steel portfolio. Essentially, the company was functioning as a revived, growing business. It's also important to note that the Supreme Court said that if the deal was scrapped, JSW Steel would get back its 19,700 crore rupees, but without any interest. This meant that it would lose several years' worth of interest income on that huge sum despite having already paid the amount years earlier. Now, while companies and investors were spooked by this unprecedented order of the Supreme Court, it was the apex court itself that brought relief. The May 2025 Supreme Court order that quashed JSW Steel's plan was delivered by a two-judge bench. Amid widespread concern, a three-judge bench headed by Chief Justice B.R. Gavai took up review petitions filed by JSW, lenders, and the government. The court invoked its review jurisdiction under Article 137, allowing a detailed rehearing. In September 2025, the larger bench reversed the earlier ruling, restoring JSW's approved resolution plan and reaffirming the IBC's principle of finality. This effectively restored JSW's ownership of Bhushan Power and Steel and got a massive cheer from India Inc. The Supreme Court said that JSW had revived BPSL, had invested in modernization, and preserved thousands of jobs. It turned a loss making company into a profitable operation. It stressed that once a resolution plan was approved, it had finality. Basically, that new claims or relitigation can't be allowed later. Any attempt to reopen settled matters undermines the sanctity of the insolvency process. The May order had said how there were unsanctioned delays and extensions beyond the resolution deadline, and this was a violation of the rules. The Supreme Court order, however, noted that JSW's delay was justified because the company faced regulatory and legal hurdles, including the ED's asset attachments and ongoing court proceedings. It said that these were legitimate impediments beyond the bidder's control and not willful defaults. Therefore, JSW could not be penalized for the delay in implementation. The court made it very clear that commercial decisions made by the committee of creditors can't be second guessed by courts unless there is fraud or illegality. The courts must respect the COC's choices. The bench observed that commercial wisdom of creditors is paramount and judicial review cannot substitute that judgment. Yes, The previous order of the top court in May had pulled up all parties for flouting bankruptcy rules. It said that the resolution professional didn't adhere to mandatory timelines, that the mandatory evidence of the eligibility of the bidders, especially JSW, wasn't all there. It pulled up the bankers for quietly accepting the delayed payment of the upfront money by JSW. The court has also pulled up JSW Steel for revisiting the resolution plan with an addendum after it was approved and for delaying the implementation of this plan. But experts across domains said that its order to send BPSL into liquidation was just unevenly harsh. MS Sahu, who served as the first chairperson of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India, said that while the previous SC order was legally sound, it was completely hollow economically. That the IBC was an economic law and it must embed principles of both economics and law within itself. Experts said that if there was a fiscal problem within the resolution process, it needed a focus on fiscal remedy, not a completely impractical remedy of this scale. That there was an asset which had turned profitable and was still being put into liquidation. And that made no commercial sense. The Supreme Court judgment provides significant relief not only to JSW but also the entire IBC regime, which was put into significant jeopardy by the earlier judgment. The previous judgment raised doubts over the finality of an implemented resolution plan and successful turnaround of corporate debtors. The final judgment reiterated the supremacy of the COC's commercial wisdom. It restored the trust of various market players, including creditors and prospective resolution applicants under the IBC. Which brings us to our next and the last chapter. Where do we go from here? The IBC remains a work in progress. Yes, it was a big reform, and yes, it has resolved hundreds of cases already. One of the biggest successes came in 2019 when ArcelorMittal acquired SR Steel for about 42,000 crore rupees. Banks recovered more than 90% of their dues in this case. Another major example was Tata Steel's takeover of Bhushan Steel that we have already mentioned. This was among the first large IBC cases to close smoothly. The case of DHFL, the first major non banking finance company, was also resolved under the IBC. As per the RBI's December 2024 report, the IBC accounted for 48% of all bank recoveries, making it India's leading recovery route. By December 2024, 8,175 insolvency cases were filed, 3,485 companies rescued, and creditors realized 3.58 lakh crore rupees. The government has introduced 6 amendments to it over the years and 122 regulation changes. The IBC needs reforms to fix long delays, endless litigation, and lack of clarity in areas like cross border and group insolvency. And to address this, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman introduced the IBC Amendment Bill 2025 earlier this year, proposing quicker admission timelines, creditor led out of court resolutions, and clearer rules for complex insolvencies. Bhushan Power and Steel's downfall also highlighted how banks' indiscriminate lending during the boom years of 2005 and 2012 created massive NPAs across sectors. And if India wants to truly fix its bad loans problem, it may need to look beyond just the bankruptcy code. It needs sharp bank due diligence, stricter action on fraud, and a process that incentivizes quick resolution.